There we go. All right, so welcome back, everyone. So we're going to go through our last sessions for the bootcamp. So as I mentioned earlier, things we're going to be looking at now are a bit more of a review of what you already saw, and then just adding in some additional information that's more about how to make the most of the R environment than about the actual programming itself. So you'll get to review some of the exercises and concepts you saw before while we look at how to extend your use of the R environment. There we go. And yes, so this module, we're going to focus on Rmarkdown and Quarto. So what you may have noticed, right, during some of the different modules, you will have noticed that the files you're using had different extensions. And then, when you open them, they look slightly different, right? You were looking at code in both cases, but they're not actually, some of them have a lot more than code going on, right? And so we're going to be focusing on trying to understand the different file formats that are coming with this code, and then trying to figure out, different situations in which you should make use of them. So in particular, when should I make use of an R script? And in what situations is working with Rmarkdown or Quarto a lot more pertinent to what you're doing? And then at the end, you'll be able to familiarize yourselves with these outputs and the different formats you can get from these different notebook-based files. So as a quick outline, right, we're going to start by introducing the two formats, and then we're going to go look at comparing them. Then we're going to go through a couple of examples together. And then number 4 should be the fun activity. If we don't have time in this module, we'll just embed it into module 6. So when we work with Git, it'll be in the context of setting up a website. Okay, so the main reason for this module is about communicating results, right? So the focus of what we've been looking at so far is really just how do I get to the results in the first place, right? So how do I load my data into R, and how do I make use of the functions that R is providing in order to make my analysis and then the results from it, generate plots and so on. But beyond that, right, a lot of what we end up doing, the whole point of running these analyses is so that we can communicate them to others. So there's some cases, right, when the project's finished, right, we do that in the form of a manuscript where we explain our process and everything and then share our results. But before that, there's also the case of, how do I make updates about our project so that we can discuss what's being done and actually, provide much more actionable items with regards to the analysis I've written and so on, right? So, in a normal setup, if I'm trying to communicate my results, after I've run my code, right, I need to extract the plots, get the tables out, and then I need to compile it into a report I can share, right, where I have my interpretation of the results and where I'm explaining the methodology behind it. Now, the issue is, with any project meeting, when you go and present that report, someone's going to provide some suggestions, and then you need to go back, extract the plots, extract the tables, and make a new report. But you want to make sure that the way the code you're using to generate those plots in the report from the report are the exact same code, right? So a big issue that you'll find, well, if we go in here and look at how we're communicating. So if we're working with a base R script, so the .r files that showed up in some of the activities, this is kind of what your environment's looking like, right? So you see in the top left corner, right, we have the script itself, where we see the code we've written, where you're going to have a couple of comments describing some of the code itself. At the bottom left, we have the console. So we saw with Dr. Renaud that in some cases, if you want to run this specific piece of code, you can just run it directly in the console. And then we'll note, right, that the plots are showing up in the bottom right. So, the way this is set up in your environment, I can't really show up to a meeting and then just present my RStudio idea like this and then start discussing results, right? I'm going to have, with this setup, I'm going to have to click through the arrows, go through each plot, or then go back and then try and go point back and forth between the code and the plots, right? And so usually what's going to happen is you're going to try and prepare PowerPoint or some Word document, and then you're going to have to go export those plots, put them into the Word document, add your explanation, and then keep going back and forth. And then you'll notice, right, every time there's a modification to make, you have to change the code and repeat that process. So it's really tedious, and then leaves a lot of room for, on your end, making a mistake, losing which plot goes where. And then it's also a lot harder for you to explain what's going on. Then to show it more in terms of a diagram, right? In some cases, beyond just sharing the results and explaining the process, I want to be able to show what the code is, right? So in some cases, maybe you're working with someone who's a lot more technical and you want to be able to show them, oh, look, here's the code I wrote. This is the output I get. To give them an opportunity to say, well, look, it looks like there's an error with this code. You should be accounting for, some other factor in the model you've written and so on. Whereas, if you're just writing a description, sometimes it's a lot harder to get the idea from the text towards the code and go back. So what you'll usually find, right, and if let's say you work with an R script, you're going to have your code blocks that are performing different tasks. Separately from that, it's going to generate a plot, which you're going to extract. And then, separately, you have to write your text and then put these all together, right? And then because of this setup, every time you change the code, you need to go back, take out the plot, take out the text. But with this process, right, it was a lot more strain on you to try and set up how the flow of how you're communicating your analysis in that procedure. So that's where the R notebooks come in, what we've been seeing in some of these modules. So instead of the previous setup, right, where we had all of those sections were separate and we had to work to put them together, in the process of setting up your notebook, it's already structured in a way that shows the process of your research and your analysis. So if you look at the right, you'll see, right, you can start with a quick description of what the analysis is for. You have your first code block, and then immediately you see the plot, right? And then you continue from the rest. And so with this setup, it's a lot easier for someone to come and look at your file and actually understand where you're starting from, why you're doing it, and then see each segment and its corresponding result. And then conveniently, let's say you go and present this to someone and they have a suggestion for a change. All you need to do is change that part of the code, and then you can rerun this whole notebook, and that's all you have to do on your end, right? You may have to change some of the interpretation, but there's no additional work. You don't need to start exporting some of the figures. Everything stays within there. And then the great advantage this gives, on top of being a lot simpler for yourself, is it's going to facilitate the reproducibility of your workflow, right? The only change you need to make is just changing the code, and then the rest of the document stays the same. So also, if I'm talking fine, I'm talking a bit too fast, just let me know. Same with regards to Zoom, and as usual, right, if you have a question, feel free to interrupt. So the way this is achieved, so here's kind of the pipeline that's being made use of to kind of render the actual document. So we're starting with the .rmd file. So you've noticed the .rmd is the one where we see text combined with the different blocks of code we've been looking at. And R makes use of this package called knitter, which comes with the base R, so you don't have to install it yourself. And what it's doing is converting the R Markdown into a base Markdown file, which allows it from there to actually convert it into what looks like either a PDF or an HTML file. So that's what makes it actually look pretty and nice to look at, and a lot easier to share with someone for them to understand what's going on. And so what you would have seen in some of the exercises, right? It ends up being a much easier, much more intuitive setup for explaining your process, right? So if we compare what we had before, we'd have to look in 2 different places and then keep going back and forth between different plots to try and explain what's going on. But in this setup, you can imagine you could give this to a colleague and they can just read through the document in one go, and they understand each step and the corresponding results that come from it. And what some of you may have noticed, right? So if you look at some of the files we were using in the previous modules, you'll see that at the top left here, under the Save button, you'll see that there's this source and visual buttons. So you'll find in most cases, the default is the source. So this is showing you how the document is actually written. So it's just a base text file, essentially like an R script. But because of the format it has, once you switch, if you click the visual mode, that's where it actually renders it into what it would look like as an HTML. And that's been the core benefit that you get from our Markdown. So if we switch over here, you'll see that now, right, everything's written as actual text. And someone can come at this and actually just read it like a regular document, except now it's very easy to incorporate the code for them to look at and then compare and provide some critiques with regards to your work. Okay. So in general, right, I've shown a lot of advantages for why you'd want to use a notebook, but it's not an end-all solution for everything, right? There's still a reason why we still have R scripts. So the main way you'll find people making use of scripts, it's going to be for contained utilities. So I think yesterday, Dr. Russell had mentioned that he'd made a script that was just storing functions. So in a lot of cases, right, you don't actually need people to understand what's going on in the function. What they're interested in is just knowing that it does something. So you can imagine today, right, we saw the factor analysis function that was being showed in Dr. Renault's section, right? I don't need to necessarily understand how that function was implemented itself. I just need to know that it works, right? And so instead of crowding up your notebook with the definition of that function, you can put it in a separate R script, and then you just load the function when you need it, right? And that way in your notebook, you just show what you need. And so yeah, it's really useful if you just need to call a function. And then also if you have a complete processing pipeline, right? So let's say I don't really need to explain what's going from A to Z. I just need to explain what the input is and what's coming out of it. So that's usually where you see scripts. So if you look at it, for example, in R package, the entire package will be written in R script for that reason, right? You don't actually need to see what's going on within the package. What you're really interested in is that it has a function that takes an input and gives you an output. So that's, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, exactly. That's a great question. So that's exactly what's happening there. Exact. So that's all that's going on. So the package is just a compilation of functions in a script. And then when you hit library, it's just taking every single function that's within that package and loading it into your environment. So yeah, and then the main reason for that reason, right? So instead of having everything dumped inside your notebook or whatever document you're working on, the point is like saying, look, I loaded the tidyverse package for the main reason, right? I need to do some data wrangling. Beyond that, there's not more information you need to provide to someone who's reading the code. Oh, great. And now, in contrast, right, the reason people make use of a notebook is when, I'm not just interested in the input or the output, it's what's going on in between, right? So here, it's just great for when you want to document a pipeline. So we saw with Dr. Renaud, they were making use of those notebooks to explain the process that they're for the analyses the package allows for. And then it gives you a good chance to combine results with code. So, if I want to show someone how something works, I can show them a look. Here's the section of the code where I run a given function. And then right after, I show the plot that gives me the result, right? Instead of having it in a separate file somewhere else. And so there, the focus is really more on the procedure, right? So this is why it's a lot more useful, say, to try and help someone understand your process. Or, if you're giving updates to your supervisor, for example, it's a lot easier for you to be able to show, look, here's this piece of code, here's how I load the data, here are the packages I use, and then here's how the functions I ran to get the result I'm showing you. And you get this in the one document, and it's very easy for them to understand how you got to where you are at the end. Which is the key idea there. So really scripts, I just care about the input and the out. Notebooks, I'm trying to show people the process and the thinking that's going behind the code I've written. Okay, does anyone have any questions for me with regards to that? No, great. I think Zoom is good. Yeah. All right, so we'll start with a quick activity. Okay, so for the sake of time, what we're going to do is the exercises we're going to make use of for the Git example in Module 6 will be what we didn't cover here. So essentially, when we make changes to files, it'll just be working on some of the exercises we have. And so that way we can switch on to the final lecture we have for the series, and then we'll wrap up the rest at the end afterwards.